The date was August 23, 1942. It was a day that began with the heat of the late summer sun baking the steppes, but it would end in an apocalypse of fire and ash. High above the meandering curves of the Volga River, the sky did not just darken, it roared. The low guttural thrum of engines vibrated through the very ground of the city below. Then they appeared, the Luftwaffe. Hundreds of German bombers, Heinkels and Jukers, their formations stretching across the horizon like a plague of locusts, swept toward the industrial metropolis of Stalingrad. This was not merely a tactical strike, it was an act of annihilation. The German air fleet, under the command of Wolfram von Richthofen, descended in relentless waves, their bomb bay doors opening to release thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries under the crowded city. Within minutes, the geography of Stalingrad was erased. Entire districts, comprised largely of wooden housing for the factory workers, vanished in instantaneous firestorms. The heat was so intense that the asphalt on the streets bubbled and melted, trapping those who tried to flee. Streets that had hours ago been filled with families, market stalls, and playing children were transformed into rivers of roaring flame. Wooden houses collapsed like kindling, massive brick buildings, symbols of Soviet industrial pride, crumbled beneath the shockwaves, turning into hollowed-out shells. Eyewitnesses who survived that day recalled the sound. It was not just the explosion of bombs, it was a deafening, continuous roar, as if the sky itself was tearing apart. The air pressure fluctuated wildly, bursting eardrums and shattering windows miles away. Down on the ground, the scene was one of biblical horror. Civilians sprinted through smoke-filled avenues, their faces blackened by soot, clutching terrified children, dragging the wounded, and desperately searching for shelter that no longer existed. Many sought refuge in basements, believing the earth would protect them, only to find those basements becoming their tombs when the multi-story buildings above them collapsed, burying them alive in darkness and concrete. On that single day, August 23rd, nearly 40,000 human beings perished. It was a death toll that rivaled the entire casualty counts of previous wars inflicted in the span of a few hours. The banks of the Volga, once the city's lifeline for trade and transport, were choked with ash, burning oil, and debris. The river itself seemed to catch fire as oil storage tanks ruptured, spilling their blazing contents into the water. Into this chaos, marching with the precision of a machine that had conquered a continent, came the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus. They were the elite of the Wehrmacht, fresh from victories across France, Poland, and the vast expanses of the Russian steppe. To them, Stalingrad was just another name on a map, another city to be crushed under the treads of their panzers. They expected the city to fall quickly. Adolf Hitler himself viewed Stalingrad with a dual obsession. It was a strategic jewel that commanded the Volga River traffic, but more importantly, it was a symbolic prize. It was the city that bore the name of Joseph Stalin. To capture it would be the ultimate proof of Aryan supremacy in the final nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union. Soldiers of the Sixth Army were told the operation would be swift. They believed the crossing of the Volga would be secured within days, perhaps a week. They wrote letters home predicting an early return. Instead, they were marching into a nightmare that would devour them whole. The ruins that covered the city did not break Soviet resolve as the Germans had calculated. In a twist of fate that would define the battle, the destruction actually aided the defenders. The Luftwaffe's bombardment had flattened the city, but it had not destroyed its defensive potential. It had inadvertently created the world's most dangerous obstacle course. The rubble became fortifications, craters became foxholes, cellars became bunkers. Every shattered wall, every twisted steel beams concealed defenders waiting in ambush. The Soviet soldiers, the ragtag militia, and even the civilians who had been trapped in the city transformed the wreckage into a labyrinth of death. The battlefield was no longer defined by open maneuvers or tank formations. It was defined by geometry and line of sight. What followed was war reduced to its most primal, brutal form. The Germans, horrified and frustrated, coined a term for it, Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. The tanks and heavy artillery that had won the Blitzkrieg across the open fields of Europe proved clumsy and vulnerable in the narrow, choked alleys and collapsed streets of Stalingrad. A tank could not elevate its gun high enough to shoot a sniper on the third floor, nor could it depress it low enough to hit a man with a Molotov cocktail in a basement window. The fighting devolved into savage intimacy. It took place room by room, floor by floor, stairwell by stairwell. There were instances where the battle lines were drawn inside a single building. The Germans might hold the third floor and the roof, while the Soviets held the first floor and the basement, with the second floor becoming a no-man's land of booby traps and holes blasted through ceilings. A German officer later wrote in his diary that Stalingrad was not a city, but a giant furnace where men were fed into the flames and consumed. Soldiers fought with knives, sharpened spades, bayonets, and grenades. Battles were measured not by kilometers gained, but by meters, by rooms, by the length of a hallway. The psychological toll was immense. There was no front line in the traditional sense. Death could come from any direction, from above, from below, or from behind a pile of bricks. Snipers haunted the ruins like ghosts. The most famous among them was Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Urals who possessed preternatural patience and eyesight. He turned the city into his personal hunting ground. Hiding in the hollowed-out skeletons of factories or beneath piles of industrial slag, he killed dozens of German officers and soldiers each week. But he was not alone. Hundreds of Soviet snipers made the simple act of crossing a street a death sentence for German troops.
For Paulus's men, the morale began to bleed away. The omnipresent stench of burning flesh, the rotting corpses that could not be buried, and the constant nerve-shattering noise of artillery drained them. They were subjected to a 24-hour cycle of violence. Sleep was impossible. What had been envisioned as a swift, glorious advance had devolved into a grinding, bloody stalemate. German soldiers who had once marched in triumph through the boulevards of Paris now huddled in shattered tractor factories, surrounded by dancing shadows, never knowing if the next room concealed an enemy with a grenade or a knife. To understand why Stalingrad became the focal point of World War II's bloodiest chapter, one must look back to the summer of 1941. On June 22nd of that year, Hitler had launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. 3 million men had stormed the Soviet border, aiming to erase the Red Army. They had seen immense success, reaching the gates of Moscow. But the Soviet Union, defying all logic and expectation, did not collapse. The harsh winter of 1941 and the sheer tenacity of the Soviet people halted the Wehrmacht. Now, in 1942, Hitler's gaze had shifted south. He needed oil. The oil fields of the Caucasus were the prize that would fuel the Reich's war machine for eternity. To secure this, he needed to control the Volga River, the spine of Russia's transport network, and sitting on the Volga like a fortress was Stalingrad. For the Soviets, the city was more than just a strategic choke point, it was a bastion of national pride. To lose the city named after the Vost, the leader, would be a psychological blow from which the nation might never recover. It would hand the enemy a propaganda weapon as devastating as any atomic bomb. Joseph Stalin understood this existential threat. In July 1942, as the Germans approached, he issued his infamous Order No. 227. The command was simple, brutal, and absolute. Not one step back. The order forbade retreat without explicit permission, under penalty of execution. Blocking detachments, units of the NKVD stationed behind the regular army lines, were tasked with shooting deserters or anyone who fled the battlefield. The message was unmistakable. There was no place to retreat to. Behind Stalingrad lay the Volga, and beyond that, nothing but shame. The city must be held at all costs. The stage was thus set not just of armies, but of ideologies and iron wills. On one side stood Adolf Hitler, convinced of the racial and military invincibility of the Wehrmacht, obsessed with seizing the city that bore his rival's name. On the other stood Joseph Stalin, determined to defend it to the last man, willing to sacrifice millions if necessary to halt the fascist tide. As the German Sixth Army pushed forward, supported by General Hoth's Fourth Panzer Army, they crushed resistance across the steppes. Villages burned, and Soviet defenders retreated eastward. But signs of strain were already visible to those who looked closely. German supply lines were stretched thin across hundreds of miles of hostile, empty territory. Soviet counterattacks, though often suicidal, harassed the German flanks constantly, and the Red Army's capacity to absorb losses and replace them remained astonishing to the German commanders. For every unit destroyed, another seemed to emerge from the endless expanse of the Soviet interior. Eyewitnesses on both sides sensed that something more than strategy was at play. A German officer wrote home, "Hitler speaks of Stalingrad as if it were already ours, a jewel to be plucked from the Volga." A Soviet soldier later recalled, "We knew this city was a symbol. To lose the city named after the Vozhd, the leader, would be a psychological blow from which the nation might never recover. It would hand the enemy a propaganda weapon as devastating as any atomic bomb." By September 1942, the battle had narrowed into a single, brutal objective. Hitler demanded the city. Stalin demanded its defense. The fate of the Eastern Front hung in the balance. General Vasily Chuikov, the commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, was the man tasked with the impossible defense. He was a hard man, a brawler, who understood that he could not defeat the Germans in open battle. He devised a strategy called hugging the enemy. He ordered his troops to keep their front lines no more than 50 meters from the Germans. This tight proximity neutralized the German advantages. The Luftwaffe could not bomb Soviet lines without hitting their own men, and German artillery could not fire without risking friendly fire. This tactic turned the city into a series of knife fights. It stripped the Germans of their technological superiority and forced them into a war of stamina and guts. The battlegrounds became legendary. The grain elevator, a massive concrete structure, was held by a handful of Soviet sailors for days against tanks and artillery, forcing the Germans to fight for every landing and silo. The Red October steel works, the Barricadi gun factory, and the tractor plant continued production even as artillery shells tore through their roofs. Workers forged weapons by day and picked up rifles to fight by night. In some famous instances, T-34 tanks rolled directly off the assembly line, unpainted and without gun sights, driven by the workers who built them straight into combat only a few hundred yards away. For the Soviets, there was no clear line between civilian and soldier. The city itself was mobilized for survival. Women served as snipers, pilots, medics, and signalers. Children acted as scouts, crawling through sewer pipes to report on German troop movements.
The horror of the scene was indescribable. The streets were piled with corpses that froze where they fell. The stench of death mingled with the acrid smoke of gunpowder, burning oil, and unwashed bodies. One survivor wrote that the living and the dead lay side by side, indistinguishable in the gray dust of the rubble. For the civilians trapped in basements, daily existence was a cycle of hunger, thirst, and terror. They emerged only at night to scrounge for scraps of food or to collect water from the Volga, often under machine gun fire. Mothers boiled leather belts to make soup. Children chewed on clay to stop the pangs of hunger. Yet, as the autumn rains turned to snow, the Soviet 62nd Army held on. They held on to a sliver of land on the west bank of the Volga, sometimes only a few hundred meters deep. "There is no land for us beyond the Volga," became their mantra. They were fed into the meat grinder, ferried across the river on barges under heavy fire, knowing their life expectancy was measured in hours.
but they bought time. By November, the Germans had clawed their way into the heart of the city. They controlled 90% of Stalingrad, but they had not broken it. And while Paulus was fixated on the ruins, staring at the river he could not quite reach, he failed to see what was gathering on the horizon. The trap was quietly closing. By November 1942, the frozen ruins of Stalingrad had become a graveyard of men and machines. The German Sixth Army was exhausted, bled white by months of house-to-house fighting. They were convinced that final victory was near, that one last push would throw the Soviets into the river. But far from the ruined city streets, deep in the snowy steppes to the north and south of the city, the Red Army was preparing a strike that would change the course of history. This was Operation Uranus. Soviet generals Zhukov, Vasilevsky, and Rokossovsky had identified a fatal weakness in the German deployment. While the elite German units were bogged down in the street fighting, the flanks of the Sixth Army were guarded by poorly equipped Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian divisions. These allies of Hitler were armed with obsolete weapons, lacked anti-tank guns, and were stretched thin across miles of open, frozen plains. On November 19th, under skies heavy with snow and fog, the thunder of thousands of Soviet artillery guns shook the steppe. The ground trembled as the barrage began. Then, out of the mist, came the T-34s. The Soviet armor smashed through the Romanian lines like a sledgehammer through glass. The defenders, terrified and outgunned, had no chance. Their trenches were crushed, their wires scattered. Panic set in. Entire units collapsed within hours, retreating in chaos or surrendering en masse. "We had no chance against them," one Axis survivor admitted years later. "Their tanks came like waves, and our guns could not stop them." In a brilliant pincer movement, Soviet forces from the north and south swept across the frozen steppe behind the German lines. On November 23rd, just 4 days after the operation began, the two Soviet spearheads met at the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The door slammed shut. General Paulus and his Sixth Army, more than 300,000 men, along with thousands of horses, tanks, and artillery pieces, were trapped inside the city they had tried so hard to conquer. The hunter had become the hunted. Inside the encirclement, shock gave way to panic. Paulus wired Berlin immediately, pleading for permission to break out before the Soviet ring tightened and solidified. His experienced field commanders urged immediate withdrawal, warning that delay would mean total annihilation. They had the fuel and the strength to punch a hole in the Soviet line if they acted now. But Hitler's response was chillingly simple and detached from reality. The Sixth Army will stand fast. Retreat is forbidden. The Führer's obsession with holding Stalingrad turned a tactical defeat into a looming catastrophe. He assured Paulus that the city could be held as a fortress until relief arrived. To reassure his generals, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, made a grandiose promise. He boasted that his air force could resupply the Sixth Army by air. He promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies daily, fuel, ammunition, and food, which was the bare minimum needed to keep the army alive. It was a lie born of arrogance. In reality, even under perfect weather conditions, the Luftwaffe did not have enough transport planes, and the conditions were far from perfect. Winter storms, blinding blizzards, and aggressive Soviet fighter patrols shredded the German air bridge. Pilots flew into whiteouts and crashed. Others were shot down by the hundreds. On most days, the Luftwaffe managed to deliver only a fraction of the required supplies, sometimes as little as 20 or 20 tons. They were trying to feed an elephant with a teaspoon. As the days stretched into weeks, the encircled zone, known as the Kessel or the Cauldron, became a scene from Dante's Inferno, frozen over. By December 1942, temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The Russian winter had arrived with a vengeance. Every breath crystallized in the air. Metal froze to skin, peeling it away if touched with bare hands. Rifles jammed with ice and oil that turned to sludge.
For the soldiers who had marched in summer uniforms, expecting to be home for Christmas, the cauldron became a world of agony.
Hunger became the primary enemy. Rations were cut, then cut again, then practically ceased. The horses that had been used to haul artillery were slaughtered for meat. When the fresh meat ran out, they dug up the frozen carcasses of horses that had died weeks earlier. Desperate cooks boiled horse hides into thin, translucent broth. Soldiers tore apart furniture and burned wooden floorboards in makeshift stoves to keep from freezing, but the fuel never lasted through the long, dark nights. Men huddled in cellars wrapped in rags, stolen curtains, and paper, their boots stiff with ice. Frostbite spread mercilessly. It turned fingers and toes black and brittle, robbing men of the ability to even pull a trigger. Gangrene set in, and the field hospitals, lacking medicine and bandages, became houses of screaming and silence. "We had no winter clothing," one soldier wrote in a final letter. "We are skeletons wrapped in gray wool." Lice infested every seam of their clothing, carrying typhus. Dysentery weakened men until they simply lay down in the snow and never rose again. Meanwhile, the Soviet artillery pounded the cauldron day and night. The ring of steel was tightening. The Red Army was squeezing the life out of the pocket. Each barrage left new rows of bodies, frozen hard as stone, half buried in the drifting snow. Ammunition dwindled so badly that some units were down to fewer than 10 bullets per rifle. Mortars fell silent for lack of shells. Even the machine guns, the symbols of German firepower, were abandoned when the belts ran dry. Despite this collapse, Hitler's voice reached the cauldron by radio, shrill and demanding. He insisted that the Sixth Army hold firm, promising that relief was coming. That relief was Operation Winter Storm, an armored thrust led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant strategists. In mid-December, German panzers clawed their way across the steppe, fighting through blizzard conditions and stiff Soviet resistance. They reached within 30 miles of the Stalingrad pocket. The flashes of their guns could be seen on the horizon at night. For a brief, agonizing moment, hope flickered in the cauldron. Men wept, whispering that salvation was near, that they might yet break free. But Paulus received no permission to attempt a breakout to meet Manstein. He remained paralyzed by his loyalty to Hitler. And the Soviets, realizing the danger, threw massive reinforcements against Manstein's flank. The rescue force was driven back. The lights on the horizon faded. For those inside the cauldron, hope turned to ash. "We listened to the guns in the distance," one soldier later wrote, "but they never came closer. Then they faded away. We knew then that we were dead men." Christmas 1942 in the Kessel was a macabre affair. Soldiers carved Stalingrad Madonna images onto pieces of wood. They sang Silent Night in bunkers that smelled of unwashed bodies and death, while outside, the Soviet loudspeakers blared propaganda, promising food and warmth to those who surrendered and death to those who did not. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was no longer an army. It was a starving, freezing mob of broken men clinging to the instinct of survival. What had once been a force of over 300,000 had withered to fewer than 100,000 capable of bearing arms, and bearing arms was a generous description. The Kessel had split into two smaller pockets. The airfields were overrun by Soviet tanks, ending even the meager supply drops. The wounded lay in unheated cellars, thousands of them, their moans fading into the silence of hypothermia. The cauldron was effectively a mass grave sealed in snow and ice. Soviet forces tightened their grip relentlessly. The Red Army advanced block by block, smashing through the very ruins the Germans had fought so hard to capture months earlier. They buried German strongpoints under artillery fire and used flamethrowers to clear bunkers. The Germans could do little but retreat into smaller and smaller corners of the city, their uniforms in rags, their eyes hollow. Survivors later recalled men fighting with bayonets and spades,
not from a hope of victory, but from a desperation to delay the inevitable, or perhaps simply to find a quicker end than starvation. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler coming to power, the Führer promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Generalfeldmarschall, or Field Marshal. No German field marshal in history had ever surrendered. The implication was clear. Paulus was expected to commit suicide to preserve the honor of the Reich. He was to make himself a martyr. But Paulus, staring at the ruins of his army and the suffering of his men, finally broke with his master. He reportedly said, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal." On January 31st, 1943, the southern pocket finally collapsed. Soviet troops surrounded the Univermag department store, which served as Paulus's headquarters. In the damp, dark basement, General Friedrich Paulus, the newly minted field marshal, surrendered to Soviet officers. It was an unprecedented act. The myth of the German military aristocracy's invincibility was shattered in a dingy basement in Russia.
2 days later, on February 2nd, the northern pocket was crushed. The guns finally fell silent. The scenes that followed were pitiful. Exhausted soldiers, too weak to walk, stumbled out of the ruins with their hands raised. They were ghosts, wrapped in rags, their faces frost-bitten masks of misery. Out of the 91,000 Germans taken prisoner, including 24 generals, only about 5,000 would ever return to Germany. They would not see their homes for another decade. The rest perished from typhus, starvation, overworked hearts in the brutal conditions of Soviet labor camps in Siberia and the Urals. For Germany, Stalingrad was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological catastrophe. When the news of the surrender finally broke, after days of the Nazi regime playing somber music on the radio, it stunned the Reich. The propaganda machine had promised victory on the Volga. Instead, the German people were confronted with total annihilation. Hitler raged, blaming Paulus, blaming the weather, blaming his allies. He called the surrender the greatest betrayal. But for the ordinary German soldier and civilian, the realization began to dawn. The war was no longer winnable. The Wehrmacht had lost its aura of invincibility. It had been broken not by a quick maneuver, but by a force that could outsuffer and outfight it. In the Soviet Union, jubilation swept the nation. Stalin declared Stalingrad the turning point of the Great Patriotic War. In Moscow, the Kremlin cannons fired salutes. In London and Washington, leaders hailed the Soviet victory as proof that Hitler's advance could be reversed. The Red Steamroller had begun its movement west. The ruins of Stalingrad told the full story of the cost. The city was a wasteland. Entire districts had been reduced to ash. Corpses were frozen in doorways, on staircases, and in the cockpits of crashed planes. The rubble was piled higher than the houses had been. Eyewitnesses described the city as a vast cemetery where the living moved among the dead like sleepwalkers. Yet, within those ruins lay the seeds of the future. Stalingrad had swallowed an entire German army, not just in terms of blood and bodies, but in prestige, equipment, and confidence. For the Wehrmacht, it was the beginning of a long, bloody retreat that would end 2 years later in the ruins of Berlin. For the Soviets, it was proof that even the mightiest of enemies could be broken by iron will and sacrifice. The Battle of Stalingrad ended on February 2nd, 1943, but its echoes would linger for generations. Nearly 2 million lives, German, Soviet, Romanian, Italian, Hungarian, soldiers and civilians alike, were lost in this single confrontation. It remains one of the bloodiest battles in the history of human warfare. In the years that followed, Stalingrad became more than a city. It became a legend. The city was rebuilt and eventually renamed Volgograd, but the scars of 1942 remained.
the flour mill was left standing as a permanent memorial, a skeleton of brick and iron testifying to the ferocity of the fighting. Dominating the skyline today is the Mamayev Kurgan Hill, the site of some of the fiercest combat. It is crowned by the towering statue "The Motherland Calls," a colossal figure of a woman with a raised sword, roaring a battle cry to her children. It serves as the center of a monumental memorial complex. But remembrance is not only about the dead, it is about what they gave the living. Soviet propaganda in the war's aftermath celebrated Stalingrad as the ultimate proof of the communist system's strength. In literature, film, and monuments, the story of valor and sacrifice was woven deeply into the fabric of Soviet identity. For the Western Allies, too, Stalingrad proved a sobering lesson. It made clear that the Eastern Front was the primary theater of the war, the crucible in which Nazi Germany was truly destroyed. It laid the groundwork for the post-war order and the rise of the Soviet Union as a superpower. On the human level, the legacy is one of profound sorrow and awe. Memorials still stand in Volgograd. Pilgrims walk the stairs of Mamayev Kurgan, reading names inscribed in stone, pausing before the eternal flame that guards the Hall of the Fallen. Each spring, as the snow melts and the earth shifts, new remains are discovered. Bones, rusty helmets, unexploded shells. Relatives still lay wreaths for grandfathers they never knew. The voices of the survivors, the veterans who fought room to room, the civilians who lived on clay and water, carry with them the memories of a winter that froze flesh and a fire that consumed a city. Their stories ensure that the ruins are not just stones, but warnings. Stalingrad's legacy is a stark reminder to the world that power tempered by hubris can collapse, that a people defending their home possess a strength that transcends logic, and that resilience can spring from the deepest crucible of suffering. The city that Hitler vowed to take became the place where his army met a winter it could not conquer, a winter colder than bullets. As we look back on the heights of the Volga today, the memory of those who died in the fire and snow returns us to the inferno of 1942. It serves as a warning, carved in brick and bone, that the cost of war is always more than territory. It is measured in the lost generations, in the destruction of the human spirit, and in the endurance of those who, when faced with the apocalypse, refused to take one step back.